Welcome to the launch of the new Digital Model Language Seminar Series, which Naomi Wells and I are co-convening. This seminar series has been made possible by the generous backing of the HRC-funded Open World Research Initiative, OWRI, and is supported by our two OWRI-funded projects, Cross-Language Dynamics, Reshaping Community, and Language Acts and World Making, and by the AHRC Leadership Fellow for Modern Languages, Janice Carruthers, and by the practical support of many colleagues, too many to mention here, but I do want to mention Renata Brandau, who's been very supportive. It's the start of what we hope will eventually become a self-sustaining series of language-sensitive conversations and interactions around such diverse areas as digital cultural studies, digital archives, digital ethnography, digital discourse analysis, language teaching and digital technologies, and digital or computational approaches to the study of language and text, all with a primary focus on languages other than English. The idea for this seminar series arose from a conversation Naomi and I had around about a year ago at the conference of the Hispanist Association HGBI at Leeds, and it's inspired on the one hand by the seminar series such as the Digital History and Digital Classicist, and also by online initiatives within modern languages such as the Digital Latin American Cultures Network. And it's guided by a sense that modern language-based or language-aware digital research generally lack visibility, and we're looking at ways in which to demonstrate the value, potential, and breadth of interactions between, on the one hand, digital media and technologies, and on the other, research and education in modern languages. And we wanted to find a way of bringing together conversations between people, initiatives, and various research threads in order to try and articulate what these interactions mean and how they can both understand on the one hand, how they can both advance on the one hand our understanding of digital methods in modern language research and teaching, but also enrich digital studies from language-based perspectives. Some language-related fields, notably language learning or linguistics, have already engaged significantly with the opportunities and limitations of digital, but we want to see how digital engagement looks across the spectrum, covering modern languages education and research, modern languages and cultures, modern languages across all levels of learning from primary to higher education, all modern languages beyond the pure European focus that the label has tended to imply, and potentially covering all of the world's languages, whether widely spoken or not. We also view this as an opportunity to think outside of the classroom, the curriculum, beyond current institutional realities and across different sectors. And in that spirit, we'd welcome suggestions after today's talk for future talks, future speakers, and creative formats for the series. Moving on to a few practical issues. Firstly, in terms of video footage, you'll notice there are a lot of cameras around. So please note that photographs and footage will be taken of today's talk, especially during the questions and answer session. And they may be used for publicity around the seminar series on our website and in social media. And so if you have any concerns or if you wish to be exempted from this activity, please let Naomi or myself know. And finally, in terms of future events that we're organising, the next event is already organised for the 25th of June, same location. Mandana Saif Dinipur from SOAS is giving a talk on two sides of the same coin, why the digital is blessing and curse for endangered languages. And then we're going to restart the seminar series in the autumn with another round of talks. If you wish to hear about future events, please do stay in touch and look out for an announcement very shortly about a mailing list that we plan to start up, which will help to inform people not just about this seminar series, but also allow people to talk about their own research and own initiatives. And just to mention also that when this is over, there will be drinks and a few snacks 2 floors down, but we'll tell you more about that later on. Thank you.
So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker of the series, Claire Taylor. So Claire Taylor is Gilmore Chair of Spanish and Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Liverpool. She's a specialist in Latin American literature and culture, has published on a range of writers, artists and genres across the region. Within Latin American cultural studies, she's particularly interested in the different literary and cultural genres being developed online by Latin Americans, and particularly hypertext novels, e-poetry and net art. She's published numerous articles and book chapters on these subjects, is the co-author of the recent volume Latin American Identity in Online Cultural Production, and author of the recent monograph Place and Politics in Latin America, Digital Culture, Location and Latin American Net Art. She's currently working on an AHRC-funded project focusing on memory, victims and representation of the Colombian conflict. And we're really delighted that Claire is the first speaker to launch the conference, mainly because she's very much been at the forefront in articulating the contribution of modern languages research to digital humanities and digital cultural studies. And I think this is what she will be very much addressing in her talk today, with her talk on points of intersection, digital modern languages.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for that welcome, and also to Paul and also Renata for all the work that I know that's gone into the organising of this event. It's actually a great pleasure to be here and to be here for the launch of this seminar series. Paul and I met many moons ago at one of the very first sort of steps we were making in looking at digital and what it means in modern languages, way back in an event organised in Liverpool, probably about a decade ago, I think. So it's great to be here for the launch of what promises to be a really exciting venture here in Kingston with the ORI project. So what I want to talk to you about today, as my title suggests, I'm thinking about the points of intersection between modern languages as an interdisciplinary enterprise and digital, and I've deliberately left this vague as I'm actually going to be talking about not just about what we might seem some of the digital humanities methods, but about digital culture more broadly. And I'm not, in fact, going to talk very much at all about my own research. What I want to give is a flavour of some of the points of intersection that are out there and across a variety of projects that people are working on, and give a sense of what I feel is our contribution that we as modern linguists can make to what is a really exciting time where we're witnessing new forms of communication, building on old practices, but still new forms, new genres, some really exciting phenomena that we're witnessing. So in terms of digital culture, I just want to flag up my background. I won't bore you with kind of all the details of my background, but basically speaking, I was originally trained in what was very much not digital culture and what was print culture. So my original research, my PhD research, was for the most part about printed text, though it did have one text which was billed as the first multimedia novel in Spanish, and that in fact involved a novel which had a CD in the back. So that was, at the time, it was the height of innovation. But in terms of working with digital culture, what I've tried to summarise here are just some of the changes that digital culture forces or encourages us to think about as modern linguists. And the first of these I've kind of alluded to when I talked about my background in more traditional print literature. The advent of digital culture has forced us or encouraged us, if we want to think about it positively, to rethink existing literary and cultural forms. So, go back to my example, the novel that I was trained in, how to analyse a novel. These are the kind of the techniques, and you're trained in those literary techniques. I had to rethink some of those when the novel started to look as if it was no longer bounded within the pages of a print text. So that's one thing I think as modern linguists, perhaps those of us of my generation, my grey hairs, we were trained in a particular way of approaching what were genres, and now there are new genres and cultural formats. And that's a very exciting time. I think as well what's really important is that we also have to rethink disciplinary boundaries, and that's really important in that we're maybe, if we ever were in modern language, we've always been a very heterogeneous discipline, but where perhaps we might have been schooled in one particular disciplinary area, we now need to think across disciplinary boundaries, so working not just in that example of literary texts. You would also need to be conversant with the visual, because now novels, if they're multimedia, have visual elements, and you'd also need to be working with film studies and also with computer game studies. My third point about geography and embeddedness, I think is something really exciting and also challenging for us as modern linguists, in that we tend to work kind of traditionally, I guess, with geographical boundaries, I guess, in the sense that when we're working with particular materials, we can pretty much say this is a novel from Spain, or this is a poem by a French poet, for example. But obviously with the move particularly to online that digital enables, it's meant that we have circulation, we have authorship which may transcend boundaries, and even the consumption of those texts. So I think that helps us to rethink some of the geographical notions. That doesn't mean we've lost a sense of geography, though. It just means we have to think about it differently. Again, and my third point, my fourth point here, which I think is really important, is it has made us transform understanding of what a text is. That a text is no longer, if it ever was, it no longer is ever just the physical finished object. It's actually the practices, the flows, the repostings, the procedures that have gone into the making of that text. And I think that's been part of a broader shift, obviously, in cultural studies that has massively influenced modern languages studies anyway. And then the transformation of methods, I think that's related to all of these. But I think one of the important influences that digital culture can have on our practice is to transform the way in which we actually go about our research. So what I want to, that slide was obviously about the digital culture, but now I just want to kind of situate this within a broader picture of modern languages as it's been rethinking itself. So what I've done here is just giving you a very brief summary of some of the rethinkings of modern languages that have been taking place anyway across the past couple of decades. And obviously I've had to simplify here, but just to kind of summarise some of the main issues that we've seen debated in the real sort of growth, I would say, of volumes from the mid-1990s onwards, which have been sort of isms, which have been the Francophone studies volume, the Hispanism volume. So these works which have made us actually think not just about the content, if you like, but about our whole disciplinary boundaries. So some of the things to flag up here, I think it's worth noting the questioning of the nation state as a relatively fixed category. I think that has been very much debated, certainly in my own area. I'm a Latin Americanist and a Hispanist more broadly, very much part of the debates in modern languages. The challenge, the unity, if there ever was a fixed unity between language and territory, so there's been a lot of scholarship on that, and I think this obviously relates to the what I've been talking about in terms of the digital. The questionings of the national canon. Now we know from the canon debates from at least as early as the 80s onwards, the questioning of the canon. And again, I think the advent of digital culture is one factor within this. And also a critique of area studies. So as a modern linguist, my specialism, as I've noticed, is that I'm a Latin Americanist, and there have been some critiques of the area studies model and the neo-colonial assumptions that underpin it. So to kind of exemplify some of this through Hispanism, so Martínez Zúñiga and Spadaccini have noted that what we've seen in Hispanism in recent decades is a questioning of the privileged status of literature. Now, again, in some ways it's a straw man because this is something we've been doing for a while, but it's worth noting that there has been, within modern languages, a trend from where perhaps initially as a discipline we taught national culture through the national canon, and therefore literature had a very privileged status in the curriculum. And I think that there's been certainly questioning of that privileged status of literature. There's been also, this is from Castillo and Eggington from 2016, they talk about the fading away of loyalties to national languages. So they were talking about this within Hispanic context, particularly within peninsular Spain as well. So I think that's another element which has some really interesting intersections with the rise of digital culture. Resina has also pointed out the dissolution of what was prior to that an unquestioned link between language and discipline, or culture and discipline. So that, in other words, to give you an example of my own discipline, that to do Hispanic studies, everything had to be in Spanish. Well, actually, with the rise of Chicano studies from the 70s onwards, that link has very much been questioned, that actually to do Hispanic studies is to do a whole variety of languages. Dominic Kewen, writing more recently in 2013, talked about one of the things that's become increasingly recognised in Hispanism is the plurinational reality of state culture. So he's talking here about Peninsular Spain specifically, and his point is that within Spain there are actually many nations. These are not just regions, these are actual nations. So Spanish culture in itself is plurinational. And then the last two are ones that are kind of closer, I guess, to my heart, which are questionings of area studies. So Daniel Mato in 2003 was critiquing area studies, saying that it was historically marked by the interests of imperial and other forms of transnational international dominance. Now he's basing this on the fact that area studies as a model was a US model which was, to cut a very long story short, conceived within a Cold War era and a way of the US of controlling the spheres of influence around the world. And obviously in a Latin American context, Latin America is one such area within area studies, was obviously within the US's vested interests of controlling its noisy neighbours to the south of its borders, and in particular, obviously post-Cuban Revolution, part of a broader US project for the US, avoiding further spread of revolutionary ideas. So this is kind of the background to what Mato says. But I think to kind of step back to the notion of area studies, it's important that what Mato is saying is the notion of area studies in itself, which in many ways underpins modern language studies, is in itself based on neo-imperial interests. So I think that's something to bear in mind. And then Isabel Avila, who's argued, I think quite persuasive, that Latin Americanism, so I'm a Latin Americanist, obviously I kind of believe in the project of doing Latin American studies, but he's argued that it's based on a set of exclusionary practices on the boundaries of who does and doesn't qualify as being Latin American as an object of study. So what I'm trying to do here is give you a sense of the digital that I started off with, which is questioning all of these boundaries. Actually, within modern languages itself, there's already been this parallel process of scholars throughout the past good couple of decades questioning, well, what are the actual foundations of what we're doing as modern linguists? So I think, in other words, the time's really ripe for us to think about some of the challenges of the digital and how this is a particularly propitious time for modern languages to be engaging with these sorts of challenges. And also, because I did mention briefly before I started my talk, I think it's worth noting that within debates about digital humanities, there has also, I would say about the past decade or so, been a rise in voices who are focusing on the digital humanities in terms of a critical, interrogative approach, and not just tools, computing tools that we can solve your problem with. So Klein, for example, has advocated that what digital humanities should do, it should interrogate the dominant structure of knowledge and education with the aim of transforming them. So it's not just about, providing a computing solution to your humanities problem. And then Liu has called for digital humanities informed by a whole variety of things: cultural criticism, net critics, tactical media studies, hacktivists, and that it should focus on society, economics, politics, and culture. So I think it's a really exciting time in which we have these three, if you like, they're not even disciplines, but maybe interdisciplinary enterprises. So we have digital culture, we have modern languages, and then digital humanities in a process of interrogating some of their foundations. And I think there's lots of really fruitful ways in which we as modern linguists can contribute to that. So some of the things I just want to flag up, and as I said at the start of my talk, this isn't about my research. This is very much massive, wonderful research projects going on around the country and in other countries. And what I want to do is just to summarise some of the really important work that's being done there that I think is pushing at the boundaries of perhaps what we would traditionally have thought of as modern languages research. So I'm going to mention three main scholars whose work I think has particularly inspired me, and just to give you a sense of what I think we get from their work in terms of their new approach in terms of methods, co-creation, community engagement, and then I'll end on this disciplinary identity, which obviously interests us today, because we're all in some way or other engaged in the project of modern languages. So the three that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to give you a very brief overview. So shout out to three people who've been pioneering in different ways. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of Tori Holmes. Her work was pioneering in digital ethnography and new methods. So I'll give you just a very quick overview of that within a modern languages context. Thea Pittman, again, working in modern languages context, has been pioneering in digital co-creation, new forms of practice and knowledge. And then Naomi Wells, again, within a modern languages context, but very cutting edge in terms of digital artistic forms of creation and outputs and practice-led research. I'll be showing you some images of their work as we go along. So in terms of the sorts of things that Tori Holmes does, which I think is really important for us to have a think about and maybe understand in terms of how her work on the digital is giving us or encouraging to think about new methodologies. She draws on digital ethnography. She's not exclusively a digital ethnographer, but one of the things that I think comes through in her work and was really pioneering at the time, particularly when she was first publishing, is that her work very much right from the outset started off from the premise that studying the digital required the study of the text and practices. So in other words, the flows, the recirculations, the repostings of a text are just as important as any finished object. So it's never, in other words, a case of just saying, oh, this is what this author says on their website, this is what this community group says on their blog, for example. It's actually about where is that material flown to, who is it being reposted by, what additional value has that reposting given it. So Tori, I think, has done a huge amount of work in terms of developing a method of following the flows. So it's following links that are embedded within the content to then see what that in itself tells us. And it's looking at the paths from original site of publication to dissemination on other platforms. So this overall approach, just to give you some examples of what this involves. So I've taken some quotations here from Ken McLean, and he's talking about digital objects and how digital objects are affected by the spaces through which they move. So he says that this is the reason why we need to look at those flows as much as just a digital object, a text or an image. That as they move, it increases the likelihood that copies will acquire unintended meanings, since the interpretive context they appear will be different from the object's original one. He also makes a really important point that reposting is not random. So there's a non-random and strategic nature of reposting. And that means that digital objects build up biographies as they travel. I think that's a really nice metaphor there. But digital objects, therefore, are not static, and they themselves have their own lives, and you should see how they've progressed and changed throughout the different platforms in which they've been posted. And also that reposting, so the act itself of reposting builds up and fosters the growth of interpretive communities. So communities of real kind of practice out there, as in, people in their daily lives reposting, and they themselves become part of an interpretive community about what that means. So I think that's, for me, it's a really important way in which some of the cutting edge research on digital within modern languages can really force us to rethink some of our methods. In that, I think traditionally, when we focus on a text, we would look at a text as a static text, but in fact, it's also about the practices and the flows, which are just as important. Also relating to following the flows, this is also linked to some of the Jana Burrell has done, talking about the field site. So when your field site, if we step back a decade or two, you'd go away and work in your field site as a modern linguist. You go and work in a community. For example, you might be doing participant observation, you might be doing interviews, etc. But what happens when your field site is actually a network? What happens when it's a virtual community that you're working with? So Burrell's work on the field site as network has been really quite exciting. And Postal, so John Postal, talks about social media ethnography and it produces ethnographic places, and these traverse online and offline contexts and a collaborative, participatory, open and public. So I think this gives us a really interesting sense of the way in which perhaps some of our methods might need to be adapted and changed. Because the field site, going away and doing your field research is maybe not even going away literally. You might be sitting in King's College in your office, but you're actually accessing a virtual field site. You're accessing a network resite. And then Walker has argued that what we need to look at is how to construct the location of a project when the site's technologically mediated practice and people we study exist and flow through them in a wider information ecology that is neither fixed nor can easily be located as online or offline. So I think this is, again, a really useful thing to take on board when we're working with digital material, particularly if it's obviously online material, that often people are moving constantly from offline to an online environment, and it's part of this broader ecology, a media ecology. And then in terms of the work that Tori's done, so Tori Holmes focuses very much on Brazil. She's looked at bloggers in Brazil and their practices. So she's developed practices of multi-sited ethnography and has worked on what she calls travelling texts of local content and how these texts travel and take on new meanings through their repostings and their existence throughout this media ecology. So that's one thing I wanted to flag up for you. So one way in which I think the digital and engaging with the digital from a modern languages perspective encourages us to think differently about methods. My next example is the work of Thea Pittman. So Thea Pittman based at the University of Leeds, and she has been doing a lot of work in the past year to 18 months on the politics and aesthetics of indigenous digital art. So her projects involve co-creation with different indigenous communities, some in Brazil and some in Colombia. And what she focuses on, I'm taking the title there from one of her recent funded projects. I won't read the whole title out. But she focuses on how working with these communities can be a contribution to the sustainable development agenda, but crucially that this involves responses from the perspective of the communities that she works with. So it's not a top-down model anymore. So she involves Indigenous thinkers and researchers in the co-creation of the research outputs themselves. And there's a participatory knowledge exchange mechanism which underpins the work that she does. So in other words, by working with these communities who are themselves working with digital, so these are communities who have set themselves up with a digital presence, she's not attempting then to impose, if you like, a Western model on those communities. Instead, she's co-creating with them as participants in her research. So some of the things that she's been working on, obviously go away and have a look at her research. She'll express it much better than I will. But the sorts of things that a modern languages inflected approach can bring is working with the cartography of digital art and artivists that she works with, and she argues that there's what we can see being created as an effective cartography. She's also done a lot of work on artivism, which is at the interface or the crossovers between art and activism, which is a really important growing phenomenon in Latin America and indeed in other parts of the globe. So I think that's really important in terms of the co-creative approach there. And also I think what underpins what she does doing a co-creative approach is a more egalitarian, multi-voiced approach to methods if you're working with the communities themselves. So that's an example from Thea Pittman's work, and then my final example is from the work of Maria Mencia, who's based here in the UK. Now, Maria's work is very much artistic and creative work. So she's a practice-based researcher, and her research and her outputs are actually artworks as much as any article that we would then send to our journal at the end of the process. Go away and look at her work yourself online. It's beautiful. It's much more exciting than I could possibly describe here in the course of a few minutes, just giving you an overview. But go away, look her up. Go in and have a play around on her artworks. But just to give you an example of the sorts of thing that she does. So a recent work of hers, El Barco la Esperanza, the Boat of Hope. And this was a project that she undertook on the Spanish, well, related to the Spanish Civil War. And it was, she started doing some research into Spanish Republicans, so they'd fled to France, were kept in the concentration camps. And then Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, organised a boat called the Winnipeg to take just over 2,000 of these exiles to Latin America. And what does Maria do with this? Well, she doesn't write a standard academic article about this. What she actually did was then to create an artwork. So El Barco la Esperanza, the Boat of Hope. What you can hopefully see here on the screen is that we have some words which are going across this map. And if you go away and have a look on her artist/researcher website, you see that what she's done is she's used the names of those exiles whose lives were saved by being transported in this boat. She's used it to create a digital poem which quite literally crosses the Atlantic when you play around on the artwork, and then you can click on various bits of it and you dive up and down through the different depths of the data there. So what I've hopefully given you a flavour of there, just three very quick and different examples, is some ways in which I think that some of the research that's been doing these days by people who are working with digital materials is really pushing our boundaries in terms of what we normally expect from methods, co-creation, and also practice-based research. So from this, what I want to think about for the next few minutes is what a monolanguage reflected approach to digital culture might look like then. So I've given you obviously some examples of some projects that I think are really, research projects I think are really exciting. So some of the things that I think for me as a researcher that I find important, or I always try to bear in mind when I'm approaching digital materials, is I always try to bear in mind that the digital materials, so the digital, I'm going to reify and call it the digital, always has complex negotiations with prior forms, with pre-digital forms. So by that I mean I think it's really important for us to bear in mind that when we say we approach a blog, or we might approach a website, or those of you who may be working on new digital literary genres, so when you approach electronic poetry or you approach a hypertext novel, not to get blown away by the fact this is technologically new. This is mind-blowingly different from what went on before. I think it's important to always trace the negotiations that are in existence with the prior digital forms. So, for example, you might be looking at digital newsletters that are published by a community, a monolanguage community that you're studying. Obviously, you'd need to then think, well, what were the prior journalistic practices that they're building on? Now, there will be differences, but you need to obviously understand what the prior norms are. Or, for example, if you're looking at electronic poetry, to take another example, it's important to bear in mind the huge and impressive trajectory of literary experimentation with poetic form that's been going on way before digital technologies were invented. So you might want to look back to the concretismo, to the concrete poets, or you might want to look back to Apollinaire and his calligram and moving the text around on the printed page. So I think that's one thing that's really important for us to bear in mind, or what a monolanguage inflected approach to digital culture would look like. The second point I think is really, really important that we can bring to the table as modern linguists, and it's that we can constantly, and we should constantly insist on the non-Anglophone heritage of digital culture. So by that I mean that the vast majority of scholarship on the digital does tend to be Anglophone scholarship. And it does tend to assume a US Anglophone model. So there does tend to be, and I'm obviously having to generalise, that there are some very important publications which have attempted to counteract that. But for the most part, a lot of the assumptions are driven by, well, this is an Anglophone model, and those models were predominantly developed in the US. So I think one of the important roles that we can have as monolinguists is to be constantly reminding scholars and indeed the general public that those discourses about the digital, it's not just Silicon Valley, it's not just coming from the US. There's a really important non-Anglophone heritage of digital culture and different models for digital culture that have arisen in other parts of the world. I'm thinking, for example, of in Allende, for example, in Allende's Chile, very obviously short-lived administration, but a project, CyberSyn project, which envisaged the World Wide Web before it even existed. And that would have been obviously a very different type of World Wide Web to the one we have nowadays. So I think that's really important role that we have as monolinguists. I think as well, another element we can bring is we can avoid technological determinism. So by that, I mean, one of the things that we can do is that we can constantly be that voice saying, well, it's not that the digital product, the technology drives social change. It's actually about what real people, what real communities of people do, and that's what leads to the change. So I think that's really important. So I'm thinking of some examples here, but there's been quite a lot of hype, for example, about the role of the producer with an S rather than with a C, and about the fact that this in itself is a great and liberating thing. Just one example. And I think one of the things that we can do is perhaps counteract some of that determinism and say, well, actually, what are real people doing with that? And actually, who are the people who may be being exploited in order to provide their labour for free in that model of the producer? So I think that's one of the things that we can do as monolinguists. And then finally, this is something that we've all been taught to do, and I think this is a really important role that we have, is to be critical and to be reflective. So we should be those annoying people who say, you know, when there's a debate or there's a new technology being launched, we should be those annoying people who say, well, what are the consequences? What about the people who don't speak English? What about the people who live in parts of the world where connectivity won't allow them to use those technologies? So I think that's part of our role as well in terms of what we can do with digital culture. So what I'm now going to talk about is how I then attempt, I guess, to apply that in my own research. So what I do when I'm faced with a digital product or a digital phenomena. And there are three main concerns, I guess, that I always bear in mind, and also in terms of how I then enact this in my actual research practice. So whenever I'm looking at a digital object, I'm trying to tell myself I need to look at these three things, and I need to look at them in conjunction. So the first of these is the aesthetics. So I'm looking at what, you know, as an aesthetic object, what is this digital object? And then to kind of ground this specifically in monolanguages, I think what we can then bring to that is that what's the non-Anglophone heritage there? What are the cultural forms, the genres, the tropes, the quotations, the intertextualities that are being mobilised in that digital object? And obviously, you know, as a monolinguist, I'm very excited in finding what are those that are non-Anglophone. How might this digital object, in fact, be quoting Borges? Okay, to give you an example. So I think that's one of my three kind of tripartite sort of approach, I guess, when I'm looking at a digital object, digital culture. I'm thinking about the aesthetics. At the same time, so in conjunction with this, I'm also thinking about the technologics. So I'm looking at the platforms that are used. I need to look at the technological structures, but that's not to say that the object itself is determined by it. So that's why I look at it both in relation to aesthetics, so the literary, the cultural, the pre-existing forms, the genres, the tropes. But I'm also looking at the technological structures. And then This last couple, tactical media and strategic low-tech, again, I think that's something that, as a modern linguist and specifically as a Latin Americanist, that I think it's really important to bring to the table. In that, going back to what I said about the Anglophone models of digital technologies, a lot of those models do tend to assume that therefore the latest technology, the latest hardware, the next upgrade is going to be the best possible thing. As a Latin Americanist, some of the most exciting work that I've seen is actually people working with tactical media, so working with media against the grain, so not using it in the way in which Bill Gates would have you use it, or indeed perhaps be more up-to-date, Mark Zuckerberg would have you use it, and strategic low-tech, so the deliberate use of low-tech technologies that will function and that will actually be much more effective in environments in which there is limited connectivity, in which people maybe don't have a computer, but they maybe have a mobile phone. Or to jump back through it a few years, where people used to go to LAN houses to access the internet. So I think that's something really important that we can also bring to the table. And then the third of these is kind of the ethics. So I'm always looking, when I'm looking at digital culture, I'm looking for what the geopolitics of it are. And again, that's something that we as modern linguists can bring. So I'm looking to see what are the structural inequalities that underpin digital technologies and underpin the techno-capitalist models that are related to digital technologies. And that doesn't mean that digital technologies can't ever step outside of techno-capitalism. But I think it's incumbent upon us to always be exploring and investigating and looking out for those structural inequalities that digital technologies may well have embedded in them. So I'm just going to give you now just some very brief examples of how I sort of put this into practice. So my first point about aesthetics. So some of the works that I'm really interested in are works which in many ways speak back to prior literary, cultural, artistic traditions. And they're often engaged in a dialogue, it might even be in really overt dialogue. So this work that I've taken a screenshot for you here, this is a work by Marina Serbarini. She's an Argentinian artist and writer, does some fantastic, absolutely amazing work. This piece is called Evelyn Fragments of a Reply. To cut a very long story short, it's much more fun if you go around and play it yourself than listen to me talk about it. But what she does in this work, she rewrites the James Joyce short story, Evelyn, but hopefully, as you can see from the screenshot, there isn't a huge amount of text. It doesn't look a huge amount like a short story. So what she's doing is she's updating a modernist, experimental technique with fiction that we saw some of that very early experimental work that Joyce did, which obviously then culminated in Ulysses. So Evelyn was one of the short stories in Dublin, as published in 23. And what Serbarini is doing, she's attempting to create a 21st century version of what would a modernist stream of consciousness short story look like now in a multimedia environment. This example down the bottom, this is a screenshot of a work by Jaime Alejandro Rodriguez, who's a Colombian author. This is a hypermedia novel that he wrote, he designed and created relatively recently. And what he does in this novel, he's using a very well recognised literary genre format. So it's in fact a detective novel. But as you can probably see, what we've got here is something which again doesn't look, you wouldn't think, oh, that's a detective novel that's on the shelf. It's an interactive multimedia work in which you navigate the levels of the story and the clues as you go around it. So what I would do with these sorts of works when I think about aesthetics, I'm always thinking about what are the literary and the artistic effects that this work, this digital object, that it's undertaking. And I'm always trying to bear in mind what's the literary heritage or the artistic heritage, the cultural heritage that it's building on, even though it might be doing something quite different. In terms of the technologics, so what I do when I'm looking at these works, so I have these various levels when I'm working on my analysis. I also pay particular attention to digital technologies. So some of the things I like to look at the procedural factors, so how it functions procedurally. What do you need to do if you start off there? What do you need to click? How do you then need to get to the next stage? What are the different ways in which you as reader, but you've actually become user and you've actually become activator, you actually get the work to function procedurally. I also think about the technological, the platforms that are used, and also the level of interactivity, which I think is something which is fascinating, obviously, when working with the digital. So I've taken from you here a screenshot. This is Eduardo Navas. He's a US writer, artist, author, does some fantastic works. But this, to cut a very long story short, it's titled Minima Moralia Redux. And what he's done, so he's taken Adorno's Minima Moralia, written obviously in the middle of the 20th century, so very much for the age of Fordist capitalism, prior of capitalism, and he's then remixed it and turned it into a blog-based work for the 21st century and late capitalism that we're currently experiencing now. But what he's done is he's very cleverly used the blog format, word clouds, and he's actually used search engine searches to actually comment on the genre itself, and also to comment on the underlying structures of the very capitalist system that Adorno was critiquing in a prior iteration. So that's something that I've looked at there, for example, but also bearing in mind two things. So literary technologies don't determine the cultural product. So you won't say, oh, this is a novel that uses, let's say, the blog format. Therefore, it must work in this way. I think it's really important not to do that. But also, crucially, I think it's really important to always bear in mind that technology is not inherently liberatory or experimental per se. There is often quite a lot of hype about digital technologies, and people will say, "Oh, this is amazing! This allows you to add your own comments, and therefore it's overthrown the entire structure of the world as we know it." Well, in fact, allowing the fact that technologies do allow for greater interaction, in and of itself, does not necessarily mean it's experimental or radical. It's the uses to which those are put. And there's some really exciting work by Ryan and also Murray, who have both looked at the fact that interaction itself does not always equal agency. So it's actually looking at to what extent the person who's interacting with the work really does have any agency in the work. And then finally, ethics, and this is something that very much is constantly on my mind as a Latin Americanist. This was something that initially inspired me right back when I was an undergraduate to want to look at Latin America. And I think what I mean by ethics, I actually mean the socio-political conditions under which technologies are created, and hopefully this is what I look for when I'm looking at digital technology, the way in which those conditions are actually critiqued by the digital work, the object I'm looking at. So some of the things that I always try to bear in mind when I'm thinking about the ethics of the technologies is digital technologies and their, and I've put here perceived or actual, imbrication in the techno-capitalist system. So I'm not going to give you too detailed an overview of this, but basically what we're talking about is the extent to which digital technologies prop up our late capitalist model that we're currently living in. So some of the things that I found particularly useful as a scholar, as I've been looking to see, well, what do the writers, the content creators that I've worked with, what do they actually do with the technologies? So some of the concepts that I've come across in recent years from a variety of scholars that have helped me appreciate what they're doing are some of the following. So Christian Fuchs has written quite a lot about this. There's also been some work by Mejias. So some of the technology, or some of the terminology, that helps us, or has helped me, understand the way in which technologies can function and their imbrication in the system. There's been quite a bit of work about commodity fetishism of the digital age. So the fact that we're now in the digital age, and there's quite a lot of hype about the fact that there's no longer any commodities, it's all virtual. Well, in fact, there's been a lot of research for the past sort of 3 or 4 years. It's been looking at the way in which the digital age is in itself creating commodity fetishism. The next point I think is really, really important. I think there probably can't be enough possible research ever done into this, but the alienation of the individual in informational capitalism. So the way in which users, to use a very problematic term of digital technologies, and particularly of social media, are in themselves alienated and in fact exploited. Read some of the stuff that Christian Fuchs has done, and then you'll never want to use Facebook ever again, basically. But to cut a long story short, what does he tell us? He tells us, basically, that in a prior era obviously, of Fordist capitalism, workers were exploited and there was surplus value. Now you go, when you give away all your data for free on Facebook, you are infinitely exploited. Everything is surplus value. So we are all alienated. So I think that's something which is really, really important to think about when we're looking at how digital technologies are used. And also, how do communities, people, practices, and also artists, content creators, how do they try to resist that? How do they try to resist their surplus value being taken by Mark Zuckerberg, who he's the one who's sitting there with his billions in the bank, and we're the ones who are giving him all our data for free. Immaterial labour. So there's been some really important work on immaterial labour. So Betancourt has done some work on this. But the fact that immaterial labour is in itself an illusion, because there is always a materiality. And this is some of the work by Sean Cubitt as well, has inspired me to choose this image here. Sean Cubitt has critiqued what he calls as kind of this myth of the virtual, that in fact the virtual has its roots in very much material degradation of the natural environment and all the resources that are actually needed to create the technologies which we then purportedly use virtually and digitally. The economy of online social capital. I'm absolutely fascinated, but also very much perturbed by this, the way in which social capital is functioning online, so the like economy, the way in which users are actually compelled to self-present online in order to gain online social capital. Again, there's some fantastic work that's been done recently on that. The commodification of the online self, the way in which users are compelled to commodify themselves, literally choose their own images, put their own images up, commodify themselves online. So just if we got to the end of my list, and you'll think, gosh, this is all a bit depressing, but this is this last bit which I think is really important. So momentary tactics of resistance. So what are the ways in which people who are creating, using digital technologies, or creating content through digital technologies, what are the ways in which they attempt to resist all of these phenomena, which are, in the eyes of many scholars, are driving digital technologies? So I think that for me is what I'm talking about when I talk about the ethics. It's about what are the ethical, the social, political implications of digital technologies, and also we're looking out for those, the people who are trying to resist them. So some examples. I'm just going to talk through this just very, very briefly, but you've seen. I also mentioned Eduardo Navas, so you can see I've given an example of his there. Radical Karaoke, this is a wonderful piece of artwork, digital artwork. You'll have to go and have a look at it yourself, by Belengache, who's Argentinian Spanish author. I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but just later on, just go and look at Radical Karaoke, have a play around in it, and then see what happens. So she gets you in, she draws you into this artwork, gets you playing around in it, and then you realise that you're being drawn into this system. And then something that I'm working on, which is very much at the moment. So this is the research grant that Naomi mentioned at the beginning when she introduced me. So what I'm working on at the moment, I'm having a look at the online practice of the Ruta Pacífica, Las Mujeres. So this is a pacifist and feminist group that was established in Colombia in the mid-1990s. To cut a very long story short, but they envisaged resistance to the Colombian armed conflict through precisely a gendered and feminist informed approach, so that pacifism has to be thought through the conditions of patriarchy as well. What I'll be looking at in terms of the work that I'm looking at with them is the way in which in their digital presence they're attempting to think through new symbolisms, and they're attempting to do some of those tactical moments of resistance that I mentioned previously. So looking at how their web presence is attempting, not just in terms of what it says, to be a kind of a consciousness raising, but through its actual procedural enactment, how it's encouraging through its symbolism and through through the interactivity, how it's encouraging women to rethink the way in which their voices are presented. So what I just want to end on then, hopefully what I've given you kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but what I think, and this is a bit of a mouthful, ML, Modern Languages, Critical Digital Cultural Studies, what this would be. So I think it's about understanding digital culture through kind of always bearing in mind the aesthetics, the technologics and the ethics, meaning that when we're looking at digital works, we're understanding how they're building on prior cultural traditions, but they're not bound by them. So we're not saying, okay, this digital novel is just the same as a novel that Zola wrote in the 19th century. Clearly it's not going to be. We're also looking at how digital objects make use of technological affordances, but they're not determined by them. So we're not being technologically deterministic. We're not saying it uses this technology, therefore it works in this way. And I think, again, I think I've probably said, you'll probably be aware this is going to be a really important work for me, but providing a critique of the socioeconomic conditions, all the while being aware of your own implication in them. So the digital object itself, but also yourself, there's something as a researcher I'm acutely aware of, that I'll be there looking for stuff on Google Scholar, all the while complaining about the algorithms that drive Google and the both Anglophone and other inequalities that are being reinforced through these algorithms. So I think it's being aware of our own implication in them. And just to kind of round it back off with what I started at the beginning, so I think these sorts of ways in which we can approach digital culture can be emblematic of new forms of modern languages research. It's a time in which researchers across modern languages were rethinking what we're doing, there's, as I said, the rise of all these different volumes which are looking at what modern languages practice is today. So I think a critical digital culture studies, with an emphasis on the critical, not just the digital, but critical digital culture studies, can be emblematic of these new forms of modern languages research that we're all engaged in all around the room today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire, for what was a really comprehensive but really kind of stimulating and thought-provoking paper, which it really gave a kind of framework for how someone who's maybe not approached digital culture can really kind of think about what the core issues are. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to open it up to questions. Are there any?
Thank you very much, Claire. That was really amazing, and I just don't know how I'll have the time to go and look up all the wonderful things you told us about, but it's great. I was just wondering if you have an idea, because obviously most of your examples came from Hispanic context. Are there similar amounts and levels of creative interaction with digital in other modern languages as well?
Yeah, that's a mean question. But yeah, I know that there's been quite a bit of work in French diaspora communities here in London, I think, in their use of their mobilisation of digital technologies. If you're asking more specifically about the kind of the creative, tactical media, artistic type work, so not about research projects, but about exciting stuff out there. There was quite a lot, I believe, in also Central and Eastern Europe. So whatever the tactical media notions originally arose and then got picked up in Latin America and elsewhere around the globe. I think they might have been actually developed in Amsterdam 2000 and towards the early 2000s, and a meeting there of various tactical media advocates. There's also quite a lot of tactical media work in the US, but it does tend to be quite Chicano influenced or Latino influenced. So that's kind of going back to my own research area. So no, I suppose the things that I've come across are either artworks that I've come across because they're ones I'm interested in, or research projects that I'll have come across at events such as these. But I'm sure there will be loads of stuff out there across all the other language areas. I'm sure there will be.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. I have one question about electronic literature. You refer to some digital works, mostly produced by authors, Spanish language authors. But you presented the work mostly visual-based electronic literature, so the works which we more play with it than read. But the element of experience and perception in electronic literature is significant. So I was wondering how the language, Spanish in this case, shapes the project. And I can see this project, and can I understand this, even I don't understand the language, even there is no text written in Spanish, can I still understand the meaning of this project? So, and also so related with that, so where is the place for language in this visual electronic literature?
Okay, yeah, so the various examples that I put on the screen for you, I'd actually chosen some of the most visually striking ones, but in fact in all of the all of the works that I've shown you, all the electronic literary works that I've taken the screenshots of, all of them have quite strong text-based elements. The one which is perhaps the most immediately approachable, if you don't have any Spanish, you don't have any English, you could interact with this. Probably without any knowledge of the languages. But this is one which is, as I mentioned, it's based on James Joyce short story. So within it there are excerpts of the James Joyce short story within English and Spanish. But in fact, what she's done is she's truncated them. She's deliberately blurred them. So in some cases you'll see an excerpt and you can't read it because it's deliberately been blurred. So this piece, although yes, it is electronic literature, it's very much a sensory experience. I also, because I couldn't really show you the sounds, but very much the soundscape is key to this particular piece. But all of the examples that I've given you do also have very important text-based elements. In this work here, although it looks very visual, there's in fact, we get written instructions on screen in Spanish. You get some of the character profiles on screen in Spanish, but you also have a lot of sound files which are voiced in Spanish. So in all of the elements, there is a very strong element of kind of cultural linguistic specificity. You do need some element of the linguistic knowledge to be able to engage. Some of them have also got translations, but then in many of the cases, the translations will be literal and you lose some of the nice sort of metaphors and the play there. So yeah, in terms of electronic literature, I think all of the works that I've looked at, this is very much a text-based one, but then it becomes an image-based one, so there's lots of interesting things going on there. I think there are, I mean, I'm trying to think, there's some, going back to your question about is there anything which she's not, could you appreciate it if you didn't have any of the language? There's some, what were called Annie poems, which were poems which were written by Anna Maria Uribe, and then they were animated, a bit like Calligram. And some of them you can probably appreciate those, the animations, without knowing any Spanish, because it's the visual effect of how they move across the screen. And then you'll probably be able to guess what the meaning is. So maybe and that kind of goes back to the concrete poets as well, doesn't it? Trying to find a way of creating poetry that gets beyond the restrictions of language and syntax. And yeah.
Thank you very much for a really great overview. I'm not a digital culture person, so please excuse me if I kind of ask an obvious question. I'm wondering how you use the term digital object quite often. I was wondering how you define digital object, and whether there were any correspondences between how we define a literary object. Thinking about some of the uncertainties around how to define the literary. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I was deliberately using it as a catch-all term because I was thinking, gosh, I don't want to call them texts. And then products as well assumes that I might be buying into a particular capitalist sort of techno-capitalist understanding. So that's why I used object. But it is it's not intended to kind of reify what I'm talking about or turn things into a pure object, because I am interested as much as the object in also the practices. So I suppose I was using it in that sense, and also because when I'm talking, I did give quite a few examples of electronic literature, and when I talk about electronic literature, I try hard to prevent myself from saying this novel does that, although I might well have slipped into saying that in the course of the talk, or this poem does that, because I'm aware that the writers and artists are trying to push the boundaries of genre, so they may not always agree with it being a novel or it being a poem. So just to give you an example here, this Adorno's work was a collection of aphorisms, but I've deliberately tried, when I look at that, I'm obviously looking at the tradition of aphorisms, but I've tried, when I was talking about this object, not to say I'm showing you now a collection of aphorisms, because it's clearly something it dialogues with that, but it's much more than that. So I think that was my rationale behind it, really, to find a term that's broad enough that allows for that generic sort of fluidity.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I can see from a research perspective how rich the field is. I just wondered if you could say something how you could actually apply it in seminars, or how you could teach this kind of technology.
Yeah. Oh goodness. I can
and
say lots.
assess it.
No, I can say lots and lots of stuff about that. Right. So, speaking from painful experience, it's wonderful working with. I absolutely love working with stuff like this. So I'll actually tell you about what some of the pitfalls might be first. One of the challenges of trying to deal with work like this to teach in your teaching, so I've taught it to final year students in a variety of different modules, is when things suddenly disappear offline, and that can be a bit of a crisis the week before the lecture, when your content creator has not paid their server for that year, and that is so having lots of multiple backups, I think, is really important. But how I deal with it kind of practically with my students, I try to take them through kind of a whistle-stop tour of what to actually do with this. So I have a class with them where I literally just say to them, right, first of all, take screenshots, then go through these following techniques to analyse what you can see in front of the screen. Then say that, so I literally just go through with them, because often they, you know, if you've got a text, then they pretty much know what to do with the text. But many of them have no idea how to analyse something which is constantly moving and changing and is interactive, and where do I start? So I do have a session with them where I just go through what the practicalities are. Assessing, assessing, I think I found that quite challenging. It's nice in some ways if you can get the students to themselves submit in non-traditional forms of assessment. And so I've tried blogs, which in theory sound great, but in fact you have to force the students to interact on blogs. So I found that I had to literally say to the students, I expect you to post, and I expect you to reply to at least one other person's post, otherwise they would never communicate. Posters, so we've done posters with them where they're with a module that I've taught for, I'm teaching this third time this coming year. So we get them to kind of to analyse works and then pitch it on a poster where we set up this scenario, they're pitching it for they're pitching it for the BBC. If the BBC were doing a programme, how would they sell this case study through the poster? So yeah, it is quite tricky though. It's very tricky to teach because it's new methods for them, and it's also tricky it will be easy to assess if I just got them to do an essay, but then I suppose it's not really in the spirit of the materials I'm working with. So yeah, I think that's continually a work in progress of how you teach things like this.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is about the program of the course you are teaching.
Okay.
You think that the content has changed since, introducing content from online sources? So, because you were talking about the questioning, for example, of the literature. So sort of that has brought new content, new, different topics, different people to the class that before you didn't bring into?
Yeah, perhaps actually, yeah. So an example, there's this finding module that I'm currently teaching on where in the past I'll give you a very, very brief overview. It's it's comparative memories of the dictatorship in Chile and Argentina and Germany. So I obviously teach the Latin American side of that. Used to be that it was comparing novels and written testimonies, feature films and documentaries, and then we introduced multimedia elements 3 years ago for that module now. Has it in itself attracted? I'm not sure if it's be hard to prove if it's attracted new students, just because of having we have multimedia artworks and kind of these. There's also a participatory project which is based on a map, and you can navigate around Santiago de Chile and visit virtually the different venues that have the memory of the dictatorship. Be hard to say if it's attracted new students, because I won't be able to necessarily prove that they wouldn't have done the module otherwise. But I do think it's allowed the students to then think about themselves, looking for new materials. So we make the students do their own case study. They do one assignment which is based on what we've taught them, and then they find their own case study. So it has encouraged. I have had some students who've worked on a whole variety of topics, but looked at. One student looked at some of the websites that were related to the Tiananmen Square massacre, for example. Probably they wouldn't have looked at that had we not introduced, as part of the module, that the part of the memory practices of state terror and dictatorship are also digital. So, yeah, but that's a really important question: is to what extent we can measure the the impact or otherwise of introducing these materials to our students. Yes.
If I
Yep.
could take the
Yes.
opportunity. I was wondering, because I think we've got here some people who are doing digital research, but also quite a lot who haven't, and are used to working with different types of objects. So I was just interested in, from your own experience, there are some things that are very familiar, paying attention to aesthetics, but there are other things that are quite new. What would you say are maybe the most challenging part of engaging, moving from the kind of what people are used to kind of digital objects?
Okay. So I think yes, I was very much trained in the literary, but having said that, also have a relatively strong background in film studies. So having those two disciplinary areas enabled me to be able to combine the visual and the textual relatively easily. I suppose some of the things that are most challenging are how you deal with the procedural, because it's actually a nightmare to work out even just how to document it, because if you're watching a film and you say, right, okay, I know that it's in minute 33, that's when my scene is. You're reading your novel, I know it's on page 426, whatever. But when it's an artwork such as this one, well, artwork, electronic literary work, this one she set the algorithm, so Marina Sobring has set the algorithms on this, such that I can't remember the exact number, but there's 10 different initial files, and then there's 10 that they relate to, and so on and so on. I literally don't know the number, but it's virtually impossible that you'll ever see the same thing in exactly the same sequence ever again. So it's things like that. It's the procedural elements of a work. How on earth do I start documenting this? It looks like this now, but I guarantee if you go away and open up Marina Sobring and Evelyn, you won't see that. You'll see a different configuration of images that have been randomised through the algorithms that underlie the artwork. So I think that is some of the most challenging, and I think it involves spending an awful lot of time creating screenshots. You have to spend a lot of time actually documenting what you as a researcher are doing. So you have to say, if you click on this, it gets you to that. If you hover your mouse over here, something else happens. Whereas I guess if you're using a traditional print text, it's obvious because you turn the page and you know what's on the next page. So you have to talk yourself through, literally write up how you get from one part of a work to another, and you have to do it constantly, and you have to remind yourself it's worthwhile, it's not a drag when you're sitting there typing out for yourself or recording for yourself, or the ways in which the work is navigatable. I think that's the most challenging.